We are live.
We're live, dishing on D3 women's basketball.
Where can I see the number of our viewers?
It's interesting. I have it on YouTube right here. It's like just playing muted, but it's almost like it's on a 5-second delay. So
it is
yeah,
on. I think it's 5 or 10 seconds. 3 watching now. My wife says your voice is really echoey, and so is mine. Don't know what to do about that if it's so echoey. We'll be starting here in just about a minute. Sounds like the sound is better once I turned off the sound of me watching the stream myself, which was a bad idea. Can you say something, Riley? Just say hello.
Absolutely. Hello, D3 Hoops Nation. That sound okay?
Gotta wait for the delay. All better. Well, I was going to do a fancy countdown, but we will skip that because I think it is just about 4 o'clock. Welcome to everyone here to learn about Division III basketball, and specifically from a women's basketball focus. I guess, I mean, thanks for joining, and we have no idea how long this is going to go. It might be 45 minutes. It might be an hour. 1 second. All right, I'm back. It might be 45 minutes, an hour. It could be 2 hours. We will see how talkative both of us are. But let's start off by giving some quick introductions on who we are and how are we connected to Division III basketball. My name is Scott Peterson. I'm from Seattle originally, but I live in Michigan right now. And I went to Hope College for college. And I have a few more Division III connections because I have 2 brothers. My older brother went to Calvin, and my younger brother went to Wheaton. Even though everyone else in our family, a generation up, went to Division I schools, we all decided to go to Division III schools in the Midwest. So that's me.
Yeah, and I'm Riley Zayas. For a lot of you who have seen me on Hoopsville before, who have seen me, read my work for the Scoop on D3 Women's Hoops, the blog that I run. I'm from Central Texas, a Central Texas native, and unlike Scott and many other of the Division III media personalities, I did not go to a Division III school because I am not in college yet. I'm a senior in high school, but got into Division III media with running the TrueToTheCrew.com, which is a website covering Mary Hardin Baylor athletics down in Belton, Texas. And, I had grown up going to Concordia games, Southwestern games, obviously UMHB games here in the Central Texas area, but didn't realize what all Division III encompassed, how great this level of college athletics was until I started covering UMHB and just seeing what these teams went through on a daily basis, seeing how similar their work ethic and just approach to the game was to the Division I schools I was covering at the same time. And so, got into Division III, got to know Pat Coleman and many others who were generous enough to answer all my questions as I kind of got my feet wet with learning everything about this level. And here we are now. I'm a D3 women's basketball top 25 voter, and just have tried everything I can do to promote this level of college basketball, especially the women's side of things, which is, I think, Scott, where you and I decided to do this live stream, because we just had noticed there's a lot of great content out there on the men's side, a lot of people doing a lot of hard work to just bring attention and educate people on the way that selection process goes. And you and I have both kind of been pretty outspoken as women's fans and media members throughout this past season, and thought, hey, why not put together a live stream and try to answer some of these questions people have, because there's a lot of new people in Division III and in D3 Nation right now who are all seeming to ask the same question. Is my team going to make the NCAA tournament? While we can't answer that question for you just yet, because the season isn't quite over, we're going to try to do the best job we can to put out the information there and educate people on kind of the way that this selection process works and all the different elements and components that go into it.
Absolutely. And while there's a lot of information out there on how selection and regional rankings work, we wanted to talk about it specifically from a women's basketball standpoint and some of the differences there from the men's game. And also, it's just going to be more fun for fans of women's basketball to hear names like DeSales and Transylvania, Trinity of Texas, Gustavus Adolphus, that are women's powers, and they're not men's powers in basketball. So we have, if anyone wants to send in questions, you can comment right here in the YouTube live stream chat, or you can tweet on Twitter to either of us, and we might choose your question to talk about in the show. And then we've got a table of contents here. What are we going to talk about? So this is our crash course, we're calling it, in Division III women's basketball. We're going to talk about 4 main areas. First one is statistics, kind of get you accustomed to the landscape of Division III basketball. Then we're going to talk about NCAA criteria, because you might hear, how do you stack up in the criteria? We're going to answer all those questions so that you can know how the NCAA is evaluating your team, because there are many different ways to evaluate them. But for the purposes of the NCAA tournament, only the NCAA's criteria matter. We're going to talk about regional rankings, and then we're going to talk about the NCAA tournament plus kind of a hodgepodge. That takes us right into statistics, learning about the overall landscape. Number of teams in Division III, there are 430 teams. I should have done research to figure out how many there are in Division I, Division II, or NAIA, but there's a whole lot of schools and a whole lot of basketball teams, 430 women's teams in Division III. There are 45 conferences. Currently, 44 of them get an automatic qualifier bid for the NCAA tournament. We'll talk about what that is later. There are 10 regions that are roughly geographical, and we'll talk about why teams and conferences are even separated into regions. And the number of games, every team plays around 25 regular season games. There's some quirks in there that will explain, but in general, everyone plays about 25 games. There are so many resources when it comes to Division III basketball. One of the main ones is d3hoops.com and the accompanying top 25 polls. That's kind of your one-stop shop for all the scores and journalism and information you could ever want on Division III hoops. There's also the WBCA poll, which is the Women's Basketball Coaches Association. So they also put out a top 25 poll for Division III women's basketball. There is the Massey ratings. Massey does tons of computer-based ratings of different college sports teams, but he does one for Division III women's basketball. That's a wonderful way to get a particular look into how teams stack up against one another. And then another good resource is the NCAA pre-championship handbook. That's kind of the official document the NCAA puts out that says, hey, these are the teams that are playing in Division III this year. These are our provisional schools. These are the important dates. This is how our tournament's going to be formatted. And here's the primary criteria. Here's how strength of schedule is calculated. Here's the formula. It's all there. And one of the important things in that pre-championship handbook is both the listing and the definition of the primary and secondary criteria. We're going to talk mainly about the primary criteria, but let's get to that now.
Yeah, the primary criteria, as you said, Scott, like that's what the committee uses as the basis for kind of the way that they make their selections, who's in, who's out. There is secondary criteria, which we'll talk about in a second, but these criteria are the ones that you're going to want to be well acquainted with, especially as we head into conference tournament week. There's going to be a lot of results coming in, a lot of things to be tracking. And the first one is just winning percentage, which straight up is the number of wins that a team has in their season divided by the total number of games that they played. And so, it just shows you, hey, how many games did this team win? As you mentioned, Scott, most play 25 in a regular season. Some play 24 just due to the way that their league works out, or cancellations, or whatever it might be that happens over the course of a season. But the other big number that goes right along with that and almost balances things out.
One thing on winning percentage.
Yeah.
Those are only Division III opponents count in this winning percentage. So looking down some non-Division III games that have been played, teams have played Oakwood, Kansas Christian, Multnomah Bible, Maryland Eastern Shore, Delaware State, Permian Basin. And those are, games that teams schedule for one reason or another, but those don't count towards this winning percentage calculation because they're not versus a Division III school. There are some quirks in there that happen so rarely, I don't think we really need to get into them. Yeah. And then one difference in winning percentage on the women's side compared to the men's side is the men's has a home and road calculator where games played against actually this is just for strength of schedule, so it's not in winning percentage, but games played on the road count for a little bit more, whereas the women's side has no calculations for home and road. It's all the same. So back to you, Riley, for strength of schedule.
Yeah, I was just saying, I'm glad you brought that up because there are a lot of times where teams don't play Division III school, so that doesn't factor in. And in certain instances, it can actually play a role in the way that the regional rankings turn out. One game could affect the way things are done there. But, when you bring up strength of schedule, there's obviously a good debate on whether the women's side should adopt the home and road kind of weight deal. When it comes to the strength of schedule, we don't have that though right now, so it's not going to impact this year's tournament. And really, it's a kind of a formula that the NCAA uses to calculate the strength of schedule. Going through the pre-championship manual that Scott mentioned, you can find all this information. But you have your opponent's winning percentage, and then the opponent's winning percentage are the two factors that play into the strength of schedule. And again, the opponent's winning percentage is essentially just you take, say I'm team A, right? And all the teams that I played, they're going to calculate, okay, how many wins did they have to how many losses, right? And you're going to find out the total kind of quality of the opponents that you played. So obviously, if your opponent's winning percentage is good, then you're going to have a pretty good resume to start off right there. Then the other aspect of it is the opponent's winning percentage. This is where things can get a little bit complicated, but let's just say Team A plays Team B, Team C, Team D, and Team E. Well, then what you're going to do in that standpoint is you're going to take, okay, Team B, who did they play? And then what's their opponent's winning percentage, right? Team C, you're going to do the same thing. And so by the end, you're going to get a very large number, but you're going to basically figure out, okay, the teams that you beat, how much of a top level of competition were they playing against? And so it balances things out to keep everything kind of fair across the board, but also weighted in terms of making sure that winning percentage isn't the predominant kind of a factor in this, and that you're also factoring in the quality of the teams that were played to pick up those wins. And basically what you'll do is the NCAA takes 2/3 of the opponent's winning percentage, adds it to 1/3 of the opponent's winning percentage. And then that will give you your strength of schedule. And Scott, I know we'll get into the regional rankings and also the pool C conversation in a little while, but typically the committee has has not ever come out and said it, but generally basing off of the recent years and the way that the selections have been done, you're going to need a strength of schedule above 500 if your winning percentage is not 1,000. Wouldn't you say?
Roughly, well, for a lot of things, there are teams who are regionally ranked with a strength of schedule underneath 500, and they are not undefeated. But I'm not sure there's any team with a winning percentage under 800 and a strength of schedule under 500 that are regionally ranked. But that also depends on the strength of your region, which we will get to.
Absolutely. And so then when you get into, there's a few other factors that are included in this primary criteria. And the one acronym that you're going to hear a lot is RROs, right? And that just stands for regionally ranked opponents. You're going to hear it on Twitter a lot. Hey, this team over here has 5 RRO wins compared to this team that only has 3. You might be wondering, hey, what does that mean? But basically what it does is it takes all the teams that are regionally ranked, right? There's 7 teams per region for each of the 10 regions. They're ranked by the various regional advisory committees. And these are some of the top teams of the regions, right? And so these are, again, going to be your top teams of the country, your teams that are in the NCAA tournament mix. And you're basically going to say, okay, what was this team's record against all of those teams that they played that are regionally ranked right now? It can be within your region, but it can also be outside of your region. One that comes to mind is Loras beating Babson. That counts as a regionally ranked win for Loras. And so it doesn't have to be only within the confines of your region. I think that's sometimes a misconception, is that teams can't pick up RRO wins or losses in games that are played outside of their own region, when that's not the case. Typically, teams will end up with an RRO number of maybe between 9 and 12 games. Some have a few more, some have a few less, based on the way that their conference shakes out, their non-conference schedule, and obviously their geography and the number of teams that are in their region that they have the ability to play against. So the RROs, Scott, I know you have been tracking those a lot over the course of this year, so I'll let you talk a little bit about that. But they play a huge role in the way the committee kind of can evaluate things beyond just SOS.
Right. And I think one way to view their potential use and potential value is a team like Trinity of Texas. They play in a conference that is not very strong. And so each game against those conference opponents, which Trinity of Texas does not control, right? They have to play everyone in their conference, is going to create a really low strength of schedule number for them. But if they schedule a few non-conference games that end up being against regionally ranked opponents and win those games, the committee might say, hey, if you have enough regionally ranked wins, we can see that it might offset a weak strength of schedule because you've shown the ability to beat quality opponents, even if your strength of schedule, which combines everyone you've played this year, doesn't add up. So I think that's one potential use of regionally ranked wins. I'm tracking about a third of the teams in Division III at the moment, and among roughly the top third, and they have played on average 6 games against regionally ranked opponents. At the high end, you'll have Babson and Tufts, which look to have 14 of those on their schedule, and then teams in the middle are like Hardin Simmons or Geneseo State, Dubuque, Washington College, Carthage, and so there's an interesting discussion about how much do we want to weight the number of wins versus region ranked opponents when everyone has a different number of opportunities, right? If I have 3 and you have 3, but I've played 10 of these such games and you've played 4, should your regionally ranked results, which includes wins and losses, be viewed a lot better than mine? You were a 750 winning percentage and you're 4, and I was whatever 3 divided by 13 is, right? Much, much lower. So there's many different ways that you could potentially view them. And it is not dictated to the committee in that NCAA handbook how to specifically view them. And so that's why we're often left to guess. There are lots of things in place to ensure that however one portion of the committee views them, it's viewed that way by other committees and portions of the committee so that there's consistency. But I think we will hit on some of those consistency bits in the regional ranking section.
Yeah, and this also feels like a good time to note that the regional rankings are not impacted by the D3hoops.com top 25. The D3hoops.com top 25 is a great way to kind of, analyze teams over the course of the year. The voters tend to do a very good job of balancing out strength of schedule, winning percentage, and that kind of thing, giving us an idea of who the best teams are in the country at that given point. But they do not play a role in the way these regional rankings are done or the way the regional advisory committees kind of vote on these teams. And so sometimes you'll see where a team beats a top 25 team, right? But sometimes, in the region that they're in, things can play out to where it doesn't end up as a regionally ranked result. It just depends. You can't have a one kind of thing across the board where, if they're a top 25 team, they're automatically going to be this or that. And that's a good thing to note, because the top 25 poll, as good as it is, will not impact the NCAA tournament selection process. And you also have your head-to-head results, which, speaking of regions and inter-region play, those can sometimes be an interesting aspect in how the committee views one team over another. Because if you have Team A playing Team B, right, and Team A were to beat Team B, well, then Team A, in a lot of cases, if they have very similar resumes in terms of win percentage, RRO, strength of schedule, Team A will be ahead of Team B when those regional rankings come out. And it gives committees a good idea of how they just stack up against each other, right? I mean, I tend to think head-to-head is one of the easier, kind of criteria here, because you can just see straight up who's better than the other. Again, though, that's at that given point. And so sometimes, teams can fluctuate over the course of a year, and where one might have beaten another, by the time we get to the regional rankings now in February, well, then even the team that lost has a much better resume than the team that won, in that case, back in December or early January. And I'd also add that your common opponents would be the final piece of primary criteria. Scott, you were talking about this on Hoopsville the other night after the top 16 reveal. Common opponents can be another good way to kind of analyze teams, especially within regions. Sometimes we get out of region games where two teams from the same region played the same out of region opponent. Though more often than not, it's the inter-region games. And sometimes we have 8 to 10 common opponents, depending on who these teams are. And that's a great set of data points for the committee to evaluate and be able to say, okay, who is better than the other, who played better against the same opponent between these two teams. So I think those two pieces of criteria, head-to-head and common opponents, do a good job of giving the committee some extra data points to analyze and evaluate teams that are very close within their regions.
Yeah, one thing about Division III is that, well, I mean, it's not really unique to Division III, but there are teams all over the United States. And so there are vagaries around the quality of teams from, say, Washington versus Georgia versus Massachusetts. And when those teams are largely playing teams who are geographically close to one another, it can be hard to blindly compare their winning percentage and strength of schedule when they kind of faced different types of opponents. It's hard to phrase exactly the implications there, but that's why common opponents can be so useful, because you're looking for what is a common link between these teams. So Hope and Trine are in the same conference, so they do have a lot of common opponents. But if hypothetically they didn't, they both played Wisconsin Eau Claire. And so if their resumes are really close, you can say, oh, well, Hope beat them and Trine lost to them, I believe. And so it's really nice when you have something that you can compare almost exactly. Now, maybe Eau Claire at one point in the season is very different from Eau Claire at a different point in the season, but kind of on the face of it, it's nice when two teams that you're trying to decide which one should I put into the tournament first, if they have a common opponent, that can be a really good way to break that tie.
Yeah, I would second that. I think it's one of those things where, again, no piece of criteria is perfect, right? Because it's hard to say, how good is this team in November versus this team in January or February. And so sometimes you get into some hard decisions with even the common opponents and the way you evaluate those results. But overall, I mean, I think these criteria do a very good job. And even as you talked about in Hoopsville the other night, it seems that the women's committee especially is doing a better job of kind of weighting strength of schedule in a lot of cases, ranking those regionally ranked, results, and overall just rewarding teams for playing tough schedules, especially in non-conference, which I think we need more of. For a long time, winning percentage was the number one factor in the women's selection process, but anymore it's seeming to balance itself out a little bit. So as we head into secondary criteria, right, we got through primary criteria. Now, secondary criteria, again, is the criteria that the committee will go to, especially in cases, almost exclusively in cases where they have teams with very close resumes and need to make a decision. So then you get to those non-Division III win-loss percentage. Scott noted before, win-loss percentage in the primary criteria side of things does not factor in games against non-Division III opponents. In most cases, teams are going to play their whole regular season schedule against Division III opponents. But in certain cases where you have either a conference with very few games, like the Coast to Coast Conference, or you have a team that is geographically isolated for one reason or another. We see this a lot in Region 10. They end up playing some NAI opponents, some D2 opponents. I mean, Santa Cruz is playing Dominican right now, Division II opponent. So you have some of those cases where the results that these teams are playing aren't going to be factored in their win percentage in the primary criteria. But when we get to the secondary criteria, those results will come into play. And again, this isn't going to be something you see in a lot of situations, but you will see it every now and again. A lot of teams have played at least one non-Division III game this season, particularly in some of those more isolated regions. And then you also kind of, to follow up on that, you have results versus common non-Division III opponents. Again, this isn't something you're going to have a lot, but an example we have right here, Christopher Newport and Mary Washington both played Regent this year, which is an NCCAA school. They played them a couple weeks ago. And so that's a piece of data that the committee could use as a common opponent between Christopher Newport and Mary Washington, but in a non-Division III standpoint. And then you also have your non-conference strength of schedule. This is a great metric and one that, I think a lot of us try to track over the course of the year just to see, especially in November and December, how well these teams are playing and what kind of competition they're playing against. So this is, again, outside of your conference. You take away all the conference results, only taking to play the non-conference results, and you calculate a winning percentage that way. This tends to really reward teams like the WIAC teams that generally schedule pretty tough and have some really good non-conference matchups in the first couple months of the season.
So that wraps up secondary criteria. There's 3 of those. Going back, there's the 5 primary criteria. And together, these are 8 kind of data points or metrics that NCAA folks can use to construct regional rankings and to select teams to the tournament. And that's all that they can use. You might hear people referencing something called the eye test, which is, hey, this team is ranked 6th in their region. I watched them play. They look amazing. Well, a team looking amazing or even being amazing on the court is not something that the committee can consider. They have to look at these 8 pieces of data. They cannot look at injuries. Some basketball fans might remember when Cincinnati, I think, was undefeated and the number 1 ranked team in the nation, but their best player, Kenyon Martin, broke his leg, I think, in the last game before the NCAA tournament. I can't remember if they ended up getting a number 1 seed or not, but that selection committee can take into account injuries because they're trying to create the most exciting tournament and they want the current best teams in that tournament. But in Division III, if you look at all of these metrics, they're all calculated objectively. There is no subjectivity in calculating results versus region ranked opponents or results versus common opponents. The number is what the number is. Another thing that in Division III they cannot consider is like peaking at the right time or kind of swings in the season. So maybe a team lost a game on the first game of the year, and then they've won everything since. Well, the committee's not allowed to kind of discount or ignore that first loss of the season. It's factored into their winning percentage and their strength of schedule, and just like every other game. So in that regard, game one counts the same as the last game of the conference tournament in the eyes of the committee. So the committee is not allowed to say, hey, these two teams have similar resumes, but one is 11-0 over their last 11 games, and the other one is 9-2. That's not something that they can consider. But let's move to what I call inferred principles. So why do we have these criteria, and what are the committee intending to do? Well, trying to rank 430 teams that are all across the country, some of them, because of their geography, only play 14, 18 Division III games, but they're all over the country, and they play different strengths of schedules, and we need some way to rank them and pick them to the tournament. And we can't just make it up anew every year. We want it to be fair, right? So we don't want a group of people to just decide and then they decide forever without telling people how they're doing it. Like, we don't want any of that stuff. So we've got these 8 criteria that are objective. Now, we are intentionally throwing away information that would be useful, but it's subjective. And using subjective information can get really problematic when you have a bunch of different committees trying to rank these 430 teams. And so they kind of narrow their focus by using objective criteria. I bet fairness is absolutely a goal of theirs. And they definitely want worthy teams in the tournament, right? And so that's why there is a strength of schedule metric. They are trying to compare teams across regions and geographies. That's why we have, common opponents and things that we can try to equate teams. And so I think that those are some principles around what the committee are trying to do. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about is, although there are these 5 primary criteria and 3 secondary criteria that the committee has to use, and they can only use those, they're not told, hey, because these are 5 primary criteria, you have to treat each one equal. I don't believe that they are told that. And so the committee gets to decide, hey, we think common opponents has incredible importance. We might give it 2/3 weight or half weight or something. And we think winning percentage is terrible. We're going to give it 2% weight. Like, they get to make that decision, right? But again, they're making these decisions because they want to treat teams fairly. They want consistent rankings, and they want, what's best for Division III. And so that's why us on the outside do tons of work, because we're trying to guess, based off of the regional rankings and the information that we do get, what are the relative valuations between winning percentage and results versus regional ranked opponents, or between head-to-head and strength of schedule. And yeah, that's kind of the big thing that all of us are trying to figure out. Now, you kind of answered one of these already, Riley, but what are these NCAA primary and secondary criteria used for? Are they used to construct the D3hoops.com poll? They are not. They could be, right? Like, any voter is allowed to look at the criteria, but they can use whatever they want, right? And it goes the other direction too. The D3hoops.com poll is not one of the primary and secondary criteria, so the committee members literally are not allowed to use it. When it comes to NCAA regional rankings, 100%. This is what the primary and secondary criteria are for. It's one of the 2 main things that they're for. And so they are used to construct the NCAA's regional rankings. The WBCA poll, it's just like the D3hoops.com poll, right? Those voters, actually, I can't speak. I don't know what those voters are instructed to do, but I would imagine it's similar in that the coaches in that poll are allowed to, vote however they see fit. NCAA tournament selection, just like regional rankings, I'm kind of giving it away by prepending it with NCAA, but the NCAA's primary and secondary criteria are used for NCAA stuff. So that's regional rankings and the tournament selection. When it comes to Massey ratings, there's no back and forth between anything Massey, anything NCAA, primary or secondary criteria. Conference tournament selection, again, nothing to do with this criteria. These criteria are NCAA, and used for specifically NCAA purposes. So we've talked about it a lot without really talking about it, but let's get into regional rankings. So this is, as a fan or a coach or a school, this is your first look into how the NCAA evaluates teams. So remember, there are 10 regions. There are 7 ranked teams per region. That is different from last year, but currently there are 7 ranked per region. And that's a little bit different from the men's side. The men's side has one region where there are just 6 ranked. The men are very specific in that, since there are a differing number of teams per region, because in general, conferences are geographically close to each other, and the NCAA tries to put entire conferences into the same region. The only times they don't do that, I believe, are the UAA and the C2C conferences, because those conferences are not geographically similar with their members. But the men's side says, hey, we know that there are different numbers of teams per region, so we're going to divide that number by 20%. We're going to round down, and that's going to be the number of ranked teams per region, and we're also going to cap it at 7. So that's how you get only 6 in Region 2, because there are a pretty small number of teams in Region 2 on the men's side. I haven't run the numbers on the women's side to see if we would have something similar, but it's simple. There's 7 ranked per region. I don't know how that decision was made, but there are 7 ranked per region. So each region has a regional advisory committee. They're referred to in shorthand as RACs. I don't know how many members there are per region, 5-ish, 8-ish. And the key word in their title is advisory. So advisory means that they can come up with regional rankings, but then they present them as advice to, or a suggestion to, the national committee. And the national committee can approve them or as is, or they can make some tweaks and then accept them. So these are regional advisory committees, and they're the ones who look at the NCAA primary and secondary criteria and create regional rankings within the teams in their region, and then they pick the 7 and the order of those 7.
Yeah, just to add to that, Scott, you can find the regional advisory committees on the pre-championship manual. So just for anyone interested, I think it's generally kept around 5 to 6, though depending on the conferences within that region. Every conference typically gets a member on that regional advisory committee to keep everything fair across the board.
And then those regional advisory committees, those RACs, advise the national committee. So the national committee, I said this is the committee, right? They're the ones taking in the advice on those regional rankings and setting them as official. And they're also the ones who preside over the NCAA tournament and select those at-large teams or Pool C teams. And I believe on the national committee, if they are ever discussing the school that happens to be represented by a member of that national committee, whether it's for an at-large selection or seeding or bracketing purposes, I believe they're very strict about recusal. So that committee member leaves the room during that discussion. And so they're very serious on not just that they don't want any bias in their decisions, but they don't want there to be any assumption, right? I don't believe that there is that kind of strict recusal at the regional level. But again, like these are people that probably know each other from different districts. And if someone's going to try to do something outside of the criteria to push their team up, it's going to be very obvious to people. And granted, my history in Division III is not very long, but I've never heard about anything like that. And I don't think anyone thinks anything like that ever happens. But at the national committee, because they know the NCAA tournament is so important, they're very strict about that, right? So last year, the men's committee chair, his team was very in the thick of things in the tournament. And so a lot of the decisions and the bracketing and the seating was done by the co-chair, because the chair had to recuse himself. And so, but it's this national committee who is putting their final stamp of approval on the regional rankings, making them official, and they're also deciding the NCAA tournament. So on regional rankings, The first ones that we get, did we get them in February? Yeah, I think first week of February.
Yep. Yeah.
They were alphabetical. And so that's the reasoning given there is for that first week of rankings, we don't have results versus regional ranked opponents because we don't have regional rankings yet. We're doing it here for the first time. And so we only get to use 4 of the primary criteria, not 5. And so, hey, for this first week of rankings, we're going to present them as alphabetical to kind of demonstrate that we could order them, but we're not really comfortable ordering them because we're not working with the full set of data that we want to be working with to show them in an ordered manner. And so these very first rankings come out in February. They're alphabetical, they're not numerical, and there are no results versus regional ranked opponents. And I think we often hear a question of like, hey, why isn't there more weeks of regional rankings or all year or, questions like that. And I haven't really dug into regional rankings until this year, but I started constructing my own kind of prediction or mock regional rankings. It might have been January. It might have even been before that. And what you find is that with every single game result that happens, it massively changes the rankings just because teams are 9-1 and they lose a game and they go from 900 to what's that, like 820, or, their winning percentage and SOS can change drastically with just a single result. And so, sure, like the committee could come out with regional rankings in November or December, but I think they realized far before I did, but I realized doing them this year, that there's not a ton of value to doing them way in advance of March, just because they're going to change so much. We're going to spend a bunch of time doing stuff that's going to change wildly. And so they kind of settled on this cadence. They start doing them alphabetical in February in that first week. And then that second week of regional rankings is the first time we see them in order. So now they can say, hey, we had regional rankings in week 1. We can use those to calculate for every team now, how many wins and losses do they have versus regional ranked opponents? And we get our full set of data. And that means we're a lot more comfortable on creating this numerical or ordered set of regional rankings. And then there's a week 3, and then there's a week 4. And so week 4 is the kind of the final set. That is the basis for at-large selection for the NCAA tournament. The order there matters a ton, and we'll get to that. It's hidden, but only sort of, right? So the committee basically constructs the final week of regional rankings and then make their NCAA tournament selections. And so it's not like when they're done with that regional rankings, they quickly publish them, and then a couple hours or half a day later, we see who's in the tournament. They just kind of do that all themselves. They show us who's in the tournament, and then at some point later, they show what those final set of rankings were, right? And that's probably more logistical than anything. Maybe to hold back a little bit of intrigue around the NCAA tournament, but they're not hiding anything. It's just we'll get what those rankings were later. And then an interesting part on the regional rankings is at some point in the history, again, my history is not very long, so I don't know exactly when, but if a team was ever ranked in the regional rankings, it meant that anyone who had played them gets that result as part of their results versus regionally ranked opponents. They changed that. So now it is as of the 3rd week. So let's say Mount St. Mary is ranked in the 3rd week, but then they lose and then they fall out of the rankings for the 4th week. Well, anyone who had played Mount St. Mary still gets to count them as an RRO because Mount St. Mary was ranked in the 3rd week. Similarly, if a team like Augustana is not ranked in the 3rd week, but has a great week, they're ranked in the 4th week, any team that played Augustana gets credit for RROs against them. Now, usually in that 3rd and 4th weeks, you're not seeing tons of teams move in and out, but it's kind of to create a little more stability, right? If a team has a result against a team that was ranked in week 3, just because they happen to fall out in week 4, the NCAA has kind of deemed it, I'm inferring here, we don't want to throw away that information, right? We think, hey, it was a quality team in that 3rd week of rankings. let's still say that they're of enough quality that we want to consider it as an RRO for the NCAA tournament's purposes. And then, man, Past Me really ordered these well for segues. So why are the final set of rankings so important? Well, I have not been part of the Division I NCAA tournament selections, but I believe they can select anybody they want, right? They can say this team is coming in first and this team is coming in second. There's not a whole lot of rules around the order. Well, in Division III, there is a lot of rules about the order in that the only teams that they can consider to pick first for the NCAA tournament is the top ranked team from each region who is not already in the tournament. And so they're not able to consider someone else who might be lower than whoever that top ranked team is in the region. So it's only 10 teams are evaluated at a given time for the next spot into the NCAA tournament. And that's based off that final set of rankings. And so, hey, if you're jockeying between 5th and 6th in a region with another team, you really want to get to 5th because that means you get to be considered and evaluated before that other team. And I think it's just generally helpful to be at that table, right? Because if you're at the Pool C table of 10 teams, you have a chance, right? If you're not at the table, you have 0% chance to be selected in that given round. But I think that's a cool kind of segue into the NCAA tournament. So back to Riley.
Yeah, because Scott, you're completely right. When we hear about the table a lot, and a lot of people are probably hearing about Pool C's, that is just all in terms of how teams are selected for the at-large bid. So there's 3 ways that you can qualify for the tournament. The one is Pool A, right? It's your automatic bids. Every conference that meets the minimum requirement for the number of programs within their conference, which is 6, they will get the winner of that conference tournament will get a Pool A. Or if you're the UAA, you just win the regular season title. There's no conference tournament, then you get the Pool A out of that league. So majority of Pool A bids are determined here in the next week with the conference tournaments being contested. And so what that does is then you have your 44 Pool A selections, right? That's the easiest way to walk into Selection Monday and know you're in the tournament, right? There's no nerves there whatsoever. Then you have your Pool B, which is essentially, it's not given out every year. The men don't have a Pool B, I don't believe, this year, but the women do. The Collegiate Conference of the South and the NECC. So there's 11 total teams right now that are either in a conference where in the Collegiate Conference of the South, not eligible yet for an automatic qualifier, or in the NECC, just don't meet the minimum requirement of programs. They have 4. And so you're in kind of that situation where there's one Pool B bid awarded. And so that is kind of a selection process where they just choose the best team out of those 11. Again, that's somewhat of a different process, not super notable, I guess, at this point. But the Pool C's are the ones that we're going to be hearing a lot about. You're going to be hearing a lot about those on Twitter if you follow any one of us, because these are your at-large teams, your teams that did not win their conference tournaments but are selected by the national committee as deemed being good enough to get in. There's 19 of those bids. And as Scott said, there's this thing called the table, right, where you take the top team in each of the 10 regions. So they're going to take out the conference tournament winners, the Pool A's, right off the bat. And then that's how you set up your pool or your table, I guess, to start off with when you go through the selection process. And so as one team's picked, the next team in that region will move up. And the other 9 that were not selected will remain on the table until one of them is picked up, and then the next team will slide up behind them from their region. And so that's why it's so important, these regional rankings, to be as high as you can be. And also, it's important if you are rooting for a team, you're on a team, coaching a team, whatever it might be, that is currently 4th, you do not want the other 3 teams ahead of you to lose their conference tournaments, because that would mean that they become what we call a bid stealer and will be on the table before you, even if they're picked really quickly. That is one less round that your team is on the table, which again, as you said, Scott, will decrease your chances of being selected. And so, Pool C's are the ones that Scott and I will be on Hoopsville next week talking about. There's always a lot of excitement, a lot of emotion around this selection process of those at-large teams. Always a lot of, kind of question marks, especially when you get to numbers 18 and 19 on Selection Monday and seeing who's going to come out of that. Because there are always a lot of questions on what did team number 20 do, less than number 19. And so we can have a lot of good discussions as far as that goes on that topic. But the biggest concept to understand is how the table works. And like Scott said, you want to be as high as you can in your region. They can only consider 10 at one time, which is very important to remember.
And one spot that could be really important is, let me preface it. So you might think, well, what does it matter if I'm behind another team in my region? They probably have a better resume and would be selected anyway, right? They would be selected ahead of me anyway. So what does it matter that I'm not at the table? Well, the regional rankings are constructed with only each region in mind, right? So maybe I'm considering two teams and I'm like, which of these do I put third? And they're super close. But one team has a better record versus common opponents and also is 2-0 head-to-head. So I'm like, hey, I'm going to put them third. Well, it could be once we get to the national Pool C table, well, those common opponents and head-to-head advantage that got that team to third in the region don't apply now, right? Because they're not being compared to that team that's fourth in the region. So it could be that at the national level, that number 4 team in the region actually has a better resume. But we can't look at theirs until we pick that team that is third. And so I think that's kind of the main scenario is, hey, when we're picking teams in a region, criteria like head-to-head and common opponents are relative to each other. And then once you get to the national level, they're still relative to each other, but to a different other. And that's the most common way that being behind someone can matter for a Pool C bid.
Absolutely. And that's one of those things, again, why conference tournaments are important, right? Because results this week can really affect the way that teams end up coming out in those regional rankings. On top of that, we also have this aspect of bracketing in geography. So unlike the Division I tournament, another big misconception, we don't have a place where you say, okay, the number 1 seed here, is a team from Massachusetts, right? And the number 2 seed in this pod is a team from North Carolina. That's not the way it works in Division III. Things are kept very regional. They have a budget and they have a number of flights that they would like to keep it under, excluding the Final Four. So, when you get into a situation where you might have 4 teams all within busing distance of each other, they're almost 100% going to be playing each other because you have that busing distance of 500 miles. And so it saves the NCAA a flight, and that's what the committees are instructed to do. Again, this is, from my standpoint, there's a lot of conversations we can have about this. The committees do the best job they can to create competitive pods where teams aren't having to knock out each other, good teams, but they're kept within a sort of budget that they can't necessarily, wiggle out of a whole lot. And so a lot of this is more the NCAA telling them, hey, this is your budget. This is what you have to work with. And Scott, maybe you can dive into that a little bit more in terms of, I know you've been trying to put together a mock bracket and the way things might shake out, because it is an interesting process where the selections do not affect, or the bracketing and geography does not affect the selections. But once they have their teams, their 64 teams, then they got to start figuring out where these teams are going to go and how they can get everyone everywhere with the lowest number of flights and keeping things within a relative geographical distance.
Right. So that busing distance or threshold of 500 miles is set by the NCAA. And they set that because if it's under that, they say you can bus. But if it's over that, you can't, and you have to fly, and we have to pay for it. And Dave McHugh had some direct questions to the men's the NCAA men's committee chair, Sarah Quattrocki, about like, are you instructed to have only the minimum number of flights or not more than 6? Or and she had a really funny response that there's no NCAA dark wizard that's like showing up to like wrap her knuckles and say like only 2 flights, only 6 flights. I think we do get the sense that there is a budget, and so you can't just fly everyone everywhere. It also doesn't seem like there is one specific number or a very, very clear directive of like only have one. But we, through decisions in the past, we get the sense that the NCAA wants flights limited, right? And if you think about it, a flight is not me booking a flight on Southwest 4 months in advance, right? You're flying 20 people, 25 people associated with a basketball team. And you're booking 3 or 4 days before they need to fly, right? It's not a cheap thing to do. And so like it makes sense. But because of that, there are teams that suffer because of it, right? Division III is spread out over the entire United States, but it's really highly concentrated in a couple areas. And so if you're not in those areas and you make the NCAA tournament, something might happen to you that isn't, I guess, the most fair, but it's because there's a budget, right? And so we see that with teams from Washington State, California, Texas, occasionally Virginia or Georgia, where you might have an incredibly strong team who is alive in the Sweet 16. And if they were in Division I, they would get to host 4 games or a 4-team pod for the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8. But because it's Division III, the NCAA is not willing to spend the budget to fly 3 teams to Washington or California or Texas or Georgia or Virginia. And, it is something that's absolutely unfortunate, right? But it's something that is a known that will happen, that we've got to work around. Riley and I were chatting about an idea that I have of the NCAA kind of almost creating a slush fund's not the right word, but a kind of a rolling budget where once every 2 years or once every 6 years, something, they would be willing to fly 3 teams to one of those kind of geographical island teams if they're a top 4 overall seed, to give them that sectional host, right? And so it could be that, in 2020, if they did that in 2024, Trinity of Texas is the number 1 overall seed. They're alive in the Sweet 16, and then the NCAA pays to fly 3 teams in there. I think it would be great for Division III, even if maybe they said, we're only going to do this once every 5 years. So that means for the next 4 years, even if Trinity of Texas is the number 1 overall seed every year, they're probably going to have to go on the road for their Sweet 16 matchup. But I think even if it just happens once in a while, it would be great for these locations geographically to have a huge sectional host. It's a big event. And I think it is good for the ambassadorship of the game, right? Because I think, especially West Coast, I live on the East Coast now. I used to live on the West Coast, but the West Coast gets forgotten, right? If their games are tipping at 9 and 10 p.m. on the East Coast, it's kind of a big deal for me to watch them. I think it would be cool for the knowledge of Division III, the awareness of schools out there, if they get a sectional host, if it's warranted every so often. But the fact of the matter is, at least for this year and the foreseeable future, flying 3 teams into Texas or California or Washington is just not going to happen.
Yeah, and that's as someone who covers Region 10 and obviously has gotten to know a lot of the ASC teams and some of the SCAC teams, it's definitely a frustration for a lot of the coaches, because you kind of are now in a standpoint where even if you are the number 1 overall seed, as you said, Scott, you are going to be going on the road for that second weekend. It's just the way it is. It's unfortunate. It's probably not fair. And I would also add that even less than the sectional hosting, it's the first weekend pods that can sometimes frustrate a lot of coaches, because in a lot of cases, you're going to have 4 really good teams having to all knock each other out on that first weekend just because of the busing distance, or, just because they're on geographical islands, and they they just physically can't get a team from the West Coast to the East Coast, for the cost and everything, when they could just, either bus them or, they're the only flight into the pod. There's different things that work out, and I think you'll probably see that next week as we kind of try, and over the course of this week, as we try to evaluate, how things are going to work out from a bracketing standpoint. But Region 10 has definitely suffered a little bit in past years where really good teams have gotten knocked out the first or second round, when in another region playing in another place, there's a good chance they would have gone to that second weekend. And, there's just really no way around it at this point. But Scott, I really like your idea. I think a lot of Region 10 coaches would as well.
Yep. Give them the opportunity, right? And you can put all the caveats on it you want. Once every X years, they have to be a top 4 overall seed. Maybe they have to be the top overall seed. But just opening the door to that in some very rare cases, I think would just be really, really fun.
And you mentioned on that slide, you can see on the screen, paperwork. That is a huge aspect of things, because schools need to submit their paperwork to be able to host. The NCAA has to have that. And there's big cases in the past where they haven't sent in the paperwork, and as a result, they don't get to host the second weekend when they probably should have, or even host the first weekend. And so there's definitely that element of things where, sometimes we'll be heading into Selection Monday expecting one school to host, and it comes out, a couple weeks later that they just didn't put in their paperwork. So that's definitely something that can be avoided. Hosting doesn't come easily. And I guess while we're on the topic of bracketing, I had a question about the top 16 and kind of what that reveal meant on Thursday night. We won't take such a whole lot of time on that. If you want to watch more on that, go watch the Hoopsville episode that Scott did. But the top 16 basically, is okay. If the bracket were to be done today, who are the 16 first weekend hosts? Who are the 16 best resumes right now? And in some instances, that works perfect. In others, you might have, such as on the men's side, there's going to have to be a Region 10 host. And so one of those 16 schools that was announced Thursday night, even if the season ended on Thursday night, one of those 16 would have hosted. Again, that's talking about the men's side. The women's side, the top 16 looks fairly balanced. We see Trinity, Texas in there as a Region 10 host. But the top 16, again, was more of a way for the committee to go through and say, okay, if we had to work on selecting our first weekend host, this week, who are the top 16 resumes that we're evaluating? They went through that process of the table like Scott and I were talking about. Obviously, a lot of those teams that we, had on Thursday night probably will win their Pool A's, so they won't even be on the table. But it's just a good exercise for the committee as well to evaluate things and kind of give us a look at how they're viewing things a week before the selection time. And on top of that, I'd add that rematches, I guess if we continue with the Region 10 conversation, sometimes, you might have non-conference rematches, just the way things work out. To our understanding, the committee tries to avoid those as much as they can, though sometimes geographically it's unavoidable. But the one thing that they do avoid is conference rematches. You will not see conference teams playing each other on the first weekend. Now, sometimes it happens where they'll end up playing each other in that second round. So again, I guess I should say in the first round, they won't play each other. In the second round, there's a chance that they might, again, in certain instances. But the committee tries to avoid these as much as possible, just for the sake of the tournament, keeping things competitive, giving teams opportunities to play other teams, and on top of that, not creating situations where a team has to be another team, for a fourth time that season or whatever it might be. And I guess that kind of goes into seeding as well, because there's not seeds per se. We're not seeing on our brackets a 1 versus 16, but to our understanding, they try to bracket that as well as they can to create matchups where, for lack of a better term, the top team in that quadrant or in that pod is protected. And Scott, I know you've dove into that a little bit in terms of kind of how they try to go about things. There's even situations where teams could be the number 1 seed in their pod, but don't end up hosting. And so there's a lot of different ways that the bracketing can work out from that standpoint to somewhat protect that top seed. And I guess that kind of brings us to hosting priority as well, because you have certain teams where based on their resume, where they're selected, they're in line to host. And so again, if their paperwork's in, if things work out, they're going to be a team that hosts the four on that first weekend. To my understanding, that the committee does the best job that they can to try to approximate out and see, okay, who will we have in that second weekend? Who will we have to send where? And how's that work for flight purposes? And so there's other factors that can kind of play into the hosting, especially as they set the bracket up, a week from today.
And the hosting priority, because we're talking about colleges that have men's teams and women's teams, the NCAA has had to decide, like, what do we do if both a men's and a women's team would get a host? And so they've decided on alternating years. So this year, women's teams will get to be a host in the first round if the committee picks them, and then the men's team will have to go on the road. And then it switches both in years, but then also for rounds. So this year, if we get down to the Sweet 16 and the women have to, and if, say, Christopher Newport, women would otherwise host in the Sweet 16, but their men are also alive and they would host, the men get a priority in that second round. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's what I was just going to add. When you talk about hosting priority, there were cases last year where the men ended up hosting over the women. Again, that flips this year. Things are fair and they're balanced. In the moment, I know there's some frustration, but the NCAA does the best job they can to award teams that to where the men don't end up hosting every single year, the women don't end up hosting every single year, and it keeps things balanced and fair across the board. Not always perfect, but in a lot of cases it works out. And especially for the women this year, I know that the committee probably has a little bit of an easier job because they can put teams where they want them. The men's committee will be the one this year that kind of has to follow that.
I'm going to throw you a curveball here, Riley, because I need to take a short bathroom break. So I'm going to put a question up on the screen, have you answer it, and then and then riff if you need to fill some time.
Yeah, I'd seen your comment there, Richard, and appreciate you submitting a comment. Again, folks, feel free to drop a DM. You can find me on Twitter at Zayas Riley. You can also find Scott's Twitter somewhere on here, and also drop us a comment on YouTube. But when picking pool C teams, when the committee looks at the records of region versus region, I don't know for sure how the committee kind of would evaluate that. I think in a lot of instances, they do the best job they can to award stronger regions with the kind of the benefit of the doubt, if you will, in terms of picking up those at-large bids. However, to my understanding, they're evaluating team to team rather than region to region, just to keep things fair across the board. And because you do have 10 teams, it's somewhat hard to say, okay, well, this region here has a better record than this region here, but then a region over here has a better record than the region you were initially comparing. So in some instances, I think the biggest thing that they try to do is evaluate the records of the individual teams. However, what I would add to that is say that when you have a team from a strong region, there's a good chance that they're going to have the better resume than others because of the quality of competition that they've played. Now, I can think of a few instances, even in the regional rankings right now, where that wouldn't be the case, where a team from a very strong region maybe doesn't have quite the resume that would warrant them to immediately kind of be picked off the board out of the 10 teams on the board at that given time. But I think if you're playing a strong region, you're going to be benefited by the regionally ranked results that you can pick up and things to that extent. Scott, I see you're back. I don't know if you have anything to add to this, but my kind of stance on this is the committee's really just looking at the individual teams across the board However, if you're coming from a stronger region, there's a good chance you're going to have a better resume when it comes to those regionally ranked results and strength of schedule and that kind of thing, just based on the nature of coming from a strong region. So if your region does have a better record than the other regions, there's a good chance you're going to have a leg up over some of the other teams that are being considered at the same time.
Right. So total region winning loss percentage is not a criteria that the committee can use. But if you're in a region that isn't really good and you play most of your games inside that region, your SOS is not going to look very good. Right. And I think that that's a reason that a lot of us have wanted strength of schedule to be treated more heavily when picking teams, because there is an opportunity in some conferences and regions for it to be easier than other conferences and regions for a team to have an 850 winning percentage with maybe like a 480 strength of schedule. So that's a very high winning percentage and a very low strength of schedule. And I think we want to reward that type of resume less if possible. And so, sure, if you're in an incredibly strong region, maybe it's really hard to win 70% of your games. And that's absolutely fair. But yeah, strength of the region is not a factor. And one thing you can see, we're ranking the same number of teams per region, but it could be that one region is weaker, so the teams ranked are weaker. And if you're in that region, you're probably playing all the other teams or a lot of them, which means your ranked opponents might be weaker on average. Even though you played a 3 and a 4 in region and another team played a 3 and a 4 in region, but if that region's stronger, then the system can fall down, right? Because the committee doesn't really have, or at least we don't think that they go in and say like, hey, you both beat a number 4 ranked team in the region. Let's look at the resumes of those number 4 ranked teams in the region and see how strong they are, look beyond their ranking number. And so, yeah, like differences in region strength can have small impacts. Now, when you get down to it, if it affects any teams at all, it's going to affect like the last 1 and 2 Pool C selections, just because the teams are really close in resume, but there's enough of a gap that sort of difference usually isn't causing it to swing one way or the other. But it's Division III. There are absolutely really big quirks related to geography that you really can't devise a system to get around, right? The teams are where they are and they play who they play. So we're going to mock it out. So we're going to do 2 things live here. We are going to construct regional rankings for Region 6 as of results through last night. And then we're going to show you what it would look like to select teams at the Pool C table. Now, we have never been on a committee. We don't have inside knowledge from any committee member. So we could be valuing things completely different than the way that they value them. We could be going about it way different, but we're at least going to be talking about the primary criteria and at least going through the process the way that the committee members do to kind of give you a sense for how things either are done or might be done. So we're going to start first with our regional rankings. So I picked Region 6 because there are a lot of different kinds of resumes. And so I think that that's interesting to at least go through the process of trying to value them relative to each other. And I pulled out a rough, I think, 16 teams here that I think would all be near the top. And currently, all that I have done is sort all of them by a winning percentage. That's all I've done. So how do you want to start going through this, Riley?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things you got to start with, you have it sorted by winning percentage. I think now we got to start looking at the SOS there in that second column. You know, when you kind of start to look and if you were to kind of change things around based on the stronger SOS, you're going to see a little bit of a different look. For example, Mary Washington is going to slide up there, I would think, right behind Christopher Newport, based on the way that their strength of schedule lines up. You can also look at their wins versus regionally ranked opponents and see that's relatively high compared to the other teams in that region. They have played a lot of common opponents to Christopher Newport. They've also beaten a lot of common opponents when you compare them to the rest of the teams in the region, and kind of the way that they fared against a lot of those teams in region games. So if you were to look there, Christopher Newport definitely has the edge on common opponents. Going through here, I mean, they interestingly enough, if you go and look at their schedules, they have played a lot of the same teams. So it gives the committee, and in this case, as we're evaluating it, a good idea of kind of how they've stacked up against the same types of opponents.
Totally agree. So and kind of the next place that I would go is scanning down winning percentage. Sure, we have Greensboro and Berea here, but I think that their SOS numbers are really pretty low. And so I kind of, for now, skip over them. And I'm looking at Guilford, Bridgewater, because 800 to kind of the 760 area is not a big difference. So I'm really looking Guilford, Bridgewater, Washington Lee, and Randolph-Macon and saying, hey, how do I want to differentiate these? Well, as I scan over to SOS and wins versus region-ranked opponents, Washington and Lee and Macon come out really good in both of those. So I say, hey, I kind of want one of these teams to be 3, most likely. And actually, there's a potential for Washington and Lee to be above Mary Washington, but we'll check that out later. So let's take a look at Washington and Lee versus Randolph-Macon when it comes to common opponents and head-to-head. Really, really similar here. Washington and Lee is 1 game ahead common opponents, but they also have the head-to-head. And so I think those two things, considering I already probably was leaning towards Washington and Lee already, with 1 more win versus region-ranked opponents and slightly better SOS, really nothing, but it's something, right? Because they have the exact same winning percentage. I'm going to go with Washington and Lee 3. But then at that point, I kind of want to say, hey, let me check against Mary Washington and see how these compare, because I do think that they're very similar resumes here as well. So here I see, common opponents is the same. Mary Washington has the head-to-head. I'm pretty comfortable keeping Mary Washington in that number 2 slot.
Yeah, and I think to note here too is sometimes when you get into the case, like what we have with WNL and Randolph-Macon, they play in the same conference. They're going to have a lot of common opponents. They also have some head-to-head results and things that can help you evaluate how they stack up against each other when it comes down to that. Now, Scott, we also have Emory down there with a almost ridiculous SOS. The win percentage is low, though. How do we go about evaluating that? Because, one of the things that I think you and I have both looked at over the course of this season is how you kind of balance out the win percentage with the SOS. Emory was, just for reference, 3rd in Region 6 this past week. Obviously, the recent results have kind of affected that a little bit.
Absolutely. So this is a tough job, right? Let's create a hypothetical where there are 2 teams that we know are the best and the second best team in the nation. But that second best team in the nation only plays the best team for all 25 of their games, right? They would have a 0 winning percentage and they would have a 1,000 SOS, right? And so we don't really know, and also in that hypothetical, the 430th best team in the nation also played all 25 games against the best team in the nation. They would also have a 0 winning percentage with a 1,000 SOS. And so at that point, we're not able to differentiate between those two teams with the same winning percentage and the same SOS. It's really hard to say, hey, you obviously, Emory obviously played harder opponents, but how many fewer wins kind of means that you're probably better than the teams that have a lot more wins than you, but we can see obviously played worse opponents. And I think that that's really tough. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the spread, kind of the statistical spread in winning percentage, can be kind of large. You often have teams close to a 0 winning percentage in Division III women's basketball, and you also have teams close to a perfect 1,000 winning percentage. When it comes to strength of schedule, it's really pretty constrained. You don't see a lot of teams be outside of 400 and 600. And so the same amount of points difference in strength of schedule is really pretty significant. And so here, what is Emory? They're about 85, 90 points of strength of schedule up, and they're about 100 points worse than winning percentage. Now, just because it's more significant that their SOS is better by a more significant statistical degree doesn't mean that their resume is better necessarily. But I think it's starting to paint the picture that, hey, it is a different level of opponent that Emory played. Maybe we want to take a different look at them. Do you think we should look at some common opponents in head-to-head? Do you think that on the face of it, their winning percentage and strength of schedule paired together is enough to push them up higher right now?
Yeah, and that's what you got to evaluate. You know, the one interesting kind of aspect of Emory right now is the fact that they didn't play, you know, the teams that we currently have above them right now. So it's hard to evaluate from a head-to-head standpoint, right? Like they played LaGrange twice, beat them twice. You know, that's good. They obviously have some of those other regions, but most of their schedule is composed of those UAA games. So you don't necessarily have a lot to compare against when it comes down to, you know, common opponents head to head and that kind of thing. So there's not a lot of data points you can use to say, you know, justify, I guess, Emory being ahead of one of those four that we have ahead of them besides their SOS right now, because as you said, Scott, their win percentage is not, you know, at the same level as those teams will have them. Their winning percentage is also, or their SOS is also a lot higher. Again, that's a tough decision for the committee to make. I think though Emory, you know, based on where they're at right now, seems to be a pretty comfortable spot, a spot where I could see the actual regional advisory committee ending up with Emory and trying to balance out this win percentage in SOS.
I would agree. The next place that I would start to look is probably Bridgewater and Center. I'm still not really comfortable going Greensboro and Berea because those SOSs are pretty far below all the other teams in the district in the region. So let's kind of zero in on Bridgewater and Center. So Bridgewater's got the better winning percentage, better SOS, and they have a win versus regional ranked opponent. Center does not. So right now, I think it would be pretty hard to put Center above, but we should go. So like, I really only want to look at common opponents in head-to-head if I think the resumes are pretty close already.
Yep.
We do it here, and Bridgewater is tied in common opponents, and they also have the head-to-head. So I don't think there's any way you can put Center above Bridgewater.
Not at all. Bridgewater goes above Center. Yep.
And at this point, I think you really could consider any of this next group of five, depending on how you want to prioritize things, because the lowest winning percentage of this group is Randolph, but they also have 2 wins versus regional ranked opponents. No one else has that. And Randolph also basically has the highest strength of schedule among these teams. They're in essence tied with Guilford, right? 1 point off is nothing. So I would probably lean Randolph or Guilford. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think when you start to look at this, you know, Guilford has the winning percentage right there, you know, where I would say it needs to be right at 800. And then you also look and you know, try to look at these kind of opponents you have up there. I mean, I think Guilford in a lot of areas, even right there with common opponents, ends up ahead of Randolph. Guilford has definitely come on over the course of the last couple of months. You know, if you had asked me back in December, I didn't think Guilford had a great chance to end up regionally ranked. But as we kind of look at the numbers here, look at their win percentage and their SOS, they seem to have the advantage over Randolph just by a little bit. Their resumes are really similar. And this is something, you know, again, you'll find at the bottom of a lot of regions where you're trying to distinguish between the 7 and 8 teams. I think you see a lot of times where, you know, one ends up above the other just for a small margin of one area of the criteria.
So at this point, we've kind of settled on a 9 that I think will be the top 9 in some order. If you look, Greensboro and Berea just never really got considered because kind of a dual reason: the low strength of schedule, and they don't have a win versus a regionally ranked opponent. I think if either of them had 1 win, they might have been in some of these conversations, because then the 9-17 winning percentage, I mean, it's so much higher than all the other teams that we were considering. We just think that the quality of opponent that they have played and beat is so much lower. But now that we've kind of settled on Guilford 8, Randall 9, I would like to dive into Guilford versus Center. And this is an important one because whoever we ultimately settle on as in 7th is going to, be the basis for regional ranked opponents for other teams. And whoever ends up 8th will not. And I think once you go here, I mean, it starts to look fairly overwhelmingly Guilford.
Yep, I'd agree. And you can see Guilford now. This is kind of, again, what tends to happen. Now Guilford's kind of slides up ahead of Center based on, again, some of these different criteria that you have to be concerned beyond just your straight up SOS and winning percentage.
So then that kind of is the 7. So again, we have no idea how the committee actually does it, but you're making some amount of a first pass to roughly order teams, and then you start digging into those common opponents and head to head, and maybe even the quality of the wins versus regional ranked opponents. So like Guilford versus Center is not a very good comparison, but say Mary Washington, actually that's a C to C, so this is going to be hard. But like, let's say they were even and everything. Well, Mary Washington beat a number 4 in district, and Washington only beat a number 5 as their best regional ranked wins. That would be a slight point in favor of Mary Washington if we wanted to look to that level. But this is kind of a way to order them. We'll see how close it is. This does not have Emory's result for today, so this winning percentage will go up. I think the SOS will come down just a little bit. But you can see it's hard to place a resume like Emory's because both the winning percentage and strength of schedule are so different from all the other teams in the region. And you are comparing apples to oranges, but you're wanting to make the fairest and most consistent decision. And so that brings up another good point is one regional committee might choose kind of, we would like to put an Emory type profile below a Randolph-Macon type profile. And another region may make a different decision on 2 different teams, but who have very similar resumes. And my assumption is that the national committee, this is where they take in the advice and try to come up with something that is consistent across all the regions, because they're not asking one region to be fully aware of what every other region is doing. But it's that national committee's job to say, hey, if one committee is putting a Macon type resume ahead of Emory, we want that to be the case in all regions, or vice versa.
Yeah, again, as you said, I mean, you noted a couple minutes ago, these are advisory committees. They do a very good job, but they are advisory because everyone's going to evaluate things differently, and that's where the national committee does come into play. You tend to get into tough instances, especially in some of these regions where you have, and I would even go as far as to say there's a lot of regions out there where you have a lot of common opponents, a lot of head-to-head, not a lot of difference between teams. And that's really where I think the national committee comes into play, starts evaluating things once more just to make sure that everything is balanced and fair across the board. And like you said, that this regional advisory committee is evaluating things the way that the national committee would like them to be valued. Because again, these are humans who are putting this together, not computers. And while they're trying to evaluate the numbers, some numbers may favor one team here, but then others may favor another team there. And so you can kind of get into some interesting scenarios with that.
Absolutely. So then the final thing that we're going to mock is the Pool C selections. Kind of show you how the table works. We're going to go through the first 4, both because those will probably be pretty obvious and easy, but also we want to reserve the bulk of the intrigue for Hoopsville's selection Sunday predictions. That's going to happen on Sunday, the 26th, a week from today. Riley and I believe will both be on, kind of trying to predict out those 19 women's Pool C selections. But here we're going to go to our grid. So what I've done is this is excluding teams who have the best resume in their conference. Now, they may not be the number 1 seed in their conference tournament, but I just needed something simple, and I didn't want to track down the number 1 seed in every conference. And so I excluded those teams, assuming that they will win the conference and get that Pool A automatic qualifier bid and not need a Pool C. So what we're left with is the top team in each region. So you can see here's the region 1 through 10. I don't have it listed anywhere what number they are in the region, but they're not all the same, right? They just happen to be the highest ranked team that's not already in the tournament from each region. And so here we have kind of the similar stuff that we've seen before. We got winning percentage, strength of schedule, win and loss versus RROs. And then I also have the best RRO win and the worst RRO win. I've also highlighted in green whoever has the top value in this column. And then in red, whoever has the bottom value in the column. Kind of as a way to guide my eye, but no knowledge if that's something that the committee does or not. So where should we start, Riley? Picking our number one Pool C selection from this group of 10.
Yeah, this is difficult, Scott, because now we're not only comparing, like we were a second ago, comparing teams within one region. We're trying to compare teams across 10. And so this is where, again, you have a somewhat difficult scenario. The ones that immediately I think catch your eye, you have Tufts up there with the strong SOS. They're a team that's played a lot of regionally ranked opponents. They've beaten a lot of regionally ranked opponents as well. And so their resume definitely stands out there. Now, Elizabethtown does have the better winning percentage. And Scott, I don't know if we want to factor this in. It seems, I know you and I had talked about this. You talked about this on Hoopsville. How the women's committee evaluates win percentage as compared to SOS is definitely something we have to consider. They're not evaluated equally, it seems like, in a lot of cases. So the question, I guess, for me would be, would an Elizabethtown team with a good winning percentage and not a good SOS be picked ahead of a Tufts team? Or are we going to be looking for a team more in the middle of the pack, right, where they have a fairly solid win percentage, but also fairly solid SOS? Maybe not the best in either category, but somewhat towards the top of both.
Right. And I mean, that's the $1 million question, is how exactly are these teams going to be valued? I think what we saw in the top 16s from the women's national committee is that strength of schedule and wins versus regional ranked opponents are important. They're very important. And so because of that, I don't think Elizabethtown is the pick here. And I actually don't think Tufts is the pick either. My eye goes first towards Babson because they're tied for the second highest winning percentage. They are the third highest strength of schedule and the best record versus region ranked opponents, which includes a win over a number one in a region. And so I think it would be really hard for me to pick someone other than Babson, because Babson, basically their resume gives me no reason to pick against them. If you look at Tufts, you're like, they've got one of the lowest winning percentages at this table. You look at Elizabethtown, they're like, oh, they've got the lowest strength of schedule and the lowest wins VRRO at the table. So I would lean Babson here for reasoning that I'm using. Again, I don't know what the committee uses. I feel reasonably confident that they would go Babson in this situation as well.
Absolutely, I'd agree. So you put Babson in, and then you'll bring up the next team out of Region 2, which would be Eastern Connecticut, and we're going to do the same thing over again. I would say, I mean, just from my standpoint, Oshkosh is a team that kind of catches your eye based on the fact that while their winning percentage is not excellent, similar tough situation here, but they play in the WIAC. Very strong conference. They played a good non-conference schedule. And my eye immediately goes to Chicago or Oshkosh here, though Baldwin Wallace is also a team that you have to consider. And kind of looking at the numbers here, I think Baldwin Wallace has that winning percentage that's very good, the strength of schedule that's pretty good. I think it's between these three teams here, and I don't know. I haven't looked to see if there's a common opponent between them. Don't think there is, just from the top of my head. I could be wrong on that, though, as you kind of evaluate the primary criteria.
For me, I think Tufts has to go in over Oshkosh.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I kind of set Oshkosh aside for this round and say, all right, I really like Tufts, their resume. Can I beat it? And I think you're right that Chicago is pretty close. And so we can go over here and pull up Tufts in Chicago and see where they stand. And Chicago actually comes up better there. So better versus common
Yeah.
opponents, and they have the best win versus a regionally ranked opponent. So those are some points in favor of Chicago. And so now you're like, okay, they have, 60-point worse SOS, 4 fewer wins versus region ranked opponents, but they do have 70 points on winning percentage.
Yep.
And so Tufts has Chicago has 3 categories. Tufts has 2. And this is the tough job in front of the committee, right? These are 5 primary criteria. We're kind of ignoring secondary criteria, so they might use some secondary criteria here because I think the resumes are close, even though they're very different. And I would actually, I can't remember if this is Tufts' exact resume. Tufts did win yesterday, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even with a lower winning percentage, Tufts was ahead of Chicago in the top 16. And so I would lean Tufts here for that reason.
Yeah, and Tufts, and I would also add, you bring up secondary criteria. While I do not believe either has a non-Division 3 result, you factor in non-conference SOS there, and Tufts almost certainly will come out ahead there in non-conference SOS, just based on the schedule that they played. So I think Tufts does get in here, which brings the Amherst to the table. And now, I think you kind of have to evaluate, okay, how does, if we're going to look at it, I mean, again, Chicago, I think now kind of stands out amongst their region. Again, they won today. That number isn't factored in to their win percentage. Being in case should kind of boost their SOS maybe a slight bit. I'm not sure how those numbers will shake out on that front.
Yes, now that Tufts is off the board, I think Oshkosh really is under consideration as well.
Yep.
I think Chicago and Baldwin-Wallace are similar enough, but Chicago kind of has them in a couple key categories there that I really do value that the 23 points of SOS and the extra win VRRO more than 14 points of winning percentage, because Baldwin-Wallace does have the higher winning percentage. But I would lean Chicago there. So it's kind of Chicago, Oshkosh, and do you want to consider Elizabethtown yet? I don't, because their SOS is still so much lower than everyone else's. And for the same reason, I don't want to consider Stevens or East Texas Baptist yet. So it really comes down to Chicago and Oshkosh for me. And I mean, actually, I was going to say I'm going to lean Chicago, but let's pull up there.
Let's look. Yeah.
So Chicago, I guess they have the better winning percentage against common opponents. They do have the best win versus a regional ranked opponent. They beat a number 1.
Yep.
So I think it'd be pretty hard for me to pick against Chicago in this scenario, but it is very close.
Chicago has to come off the table.
So we're going to take Chicago, and hey, that's how my model has ordered them: Babson, Tufts, and Chicago. So Chicago comes off the board in Region 8, which brings Washington University on the board, which is fascinating because they now have 8 wins versus a region-ranked opponent, which is a huge standout number. But again, it's how do I value it? Because one thing that's been discussed at length already is that wins versus regionally ranked opponents can kind of be double or triple counting. Because if you beat a team, it's in your winning percentage. If you beat a good team, meaning a team probably regionally ranked, it's going to help your SOS. And so if you're valuing VRRO wins really strongly, you're almost triple counting each of those wins, which maybe you want to be, but if you're valuing it highly, you kind of are triple counting.
Yeah, and here's the question too. So, like you bring up, so if we have WashU and Oshkosh that we're kind of comparing here, this is a question of where you bring in head to head, because Oshkosh beat them 78-42 back when they played last or played their only time this year. So, to me, Oshkosh seems like the better team initially with that head to head result. Again, though, WashU does have the advantage on the ROs.
It's close. So I think between WashU and Oshkosh, I would lean Oshkosh.
Yep.
But then I would strongly consider Baldwin-Wallace at this spot as well. So kind of looking at Baldwin-Wallace versus Oshkosh, have we brought the two of them up here?
See how these two.
So there's really nothing in between them. Like Baldwin-Wallace has beat a number 1 in our region. So that is a point in favor of them.
That would help Baldwin Wallace a lot. Yeah.
So let's see here. 120 points in winning percentage. They're down about 70 in strength of schedule. They're down 1 in wins versus regional ranked opponents, but they've beaten number 1. I would probably lean Baldwin Wallace here, but I think this is really, really close.
This is really, really close because, I mean, I think it's tough to evaluate kind of how you balance this out. I tend to like Oshkosh's resume a little bit more, especially with the head-to-head result. But again, I can completely see what you're saying about Baldwin Wallace and kind of where their resume looks really good at the table right now.
So I think it's hard to know for sure, but I do think the 120 points of winning percentage difference will go to Baldwin Wallace.
Yeah.
Because while their other 2 criteria are worse than Oshkosh, they're not bad, right? 571 SOS and 4 wins are strong numbers. And so I think it would be Baldwin Wallace here. As we hop back over to my model, though, I did have Chicago. I'm Oshkosh ahead. So I'm going against that blind ordering there. But that's kind of a way that we picked 4 teams, right? So what were the 4? We went Abson, Tufts. Who was our third?
Our third
Chicago.
was Chicago, then
Chicago, and then Baldwin Wallace. So that's kind of, we're going to stop there. But that's kind of the things that the committee is talking about, right? These numbers are going to be different. It would be easy if 2 teams had an 880 winning percentage, but one had a 500 strength of schedule and the other one had a 600. Then it would be super easy, but it's not that clean. Teams have played all kinds of different schedules and have done different things against them. And the committee is trying to do their best to be consistent and reward teams that really shine in those 5 primary criteria and the 3 secondary criteria should they need it. So that's kind of the end of our show. I don't think. Let me see if we have questions. We did have one question from a while back. This was before the top 16s, which is how do we get the committee to look at SOS more? Well, I think they just did. In the top 16s, we had teams like Whitewater and Tufts and Washington University, all who had winning percentages under 800. I really don't think that would have happened last year. I don't remember the numbers. I don't think we had anyone in the top 16. Well, I can't remember, so I shouldn't be making statements like that. But I think in general, the teams in the top 16 last year had stronger winning percentages than they did this year. And I think it's the committee is realizing is probably a negative implication. The committee wants to value teams that have played a strong schedule and done well against it, right? For some definition of well. We don't know if it's a 720 winning percentage, if it's a 780, if it's a 600, but if you have played a really strong schedule that stands out and have those wins versus regional ranked opponents, it is clear the committee wants to reward that, which I think is wonderful. So I think the committee is looking at SOS perhaps stronger than they ever have. Other things to round out our show. So we're both on Twitter. We're very active. We'd love to field questions. Riley got some questions yesterday from either schools or fans of a school saying, hey, why aren't we ranked? We're happy to field those questions, right? And talk about, hey, this is why we think you're not ranked, or we think it's terrible as well, and the committee made a mistake, right? We're going to tell you what we think about that. So definitely find us on Twitter. And then in a week, we're going to be on D3 Hoops' Hoopsville show, which is streamed on YouTube and also is a podcast. And we're going to go through the 19 women's pool C selections as we see it, right? When all the games are final. And that's always a fun show to do. So we got 19 of the 20 last year, hoping to get 19 of the 19 this year, because last year there was no pool B. This year's a pool B. I guess we can predict the pool B as well. Try to get 20 out of 20. Because the pool B is selected just like a pool C, but only from among the pool B eligible teams. So that there's no automatic qualifier because those teams are from more than one conference. But it is selected the same way. Or at least similar. All those teams will get thrown into a bucket and evaluated using the primary and secondary criteria, and the committee will pick one for the pool B. But yeah, join us on Hoopsville. I think that's it. Do you have anything else to add, Riley?
I think that's it as well. Question on YouTube about are we going to be doing a mock selection, each of us? From what I understand, I think we're going to do that together. And so I think we are all kind of going to, just like Scott and I were doing here, kind of all offer our own insight, and together kind of pull our minds together. I don't know who all is going to be on there. I know Dave will be on there. You and I will. We're going to see how close we can get to getting all 19 of those right. And again, there's some other questions coming in here that, I know we're already pushing 2 hours here, so we, don't want to go too far into this. But from what I understand, I mean, the margin of victory, I don't know how big of a role that plays. I tend to, from what I've understood, there's no, there's no role that it plays. I mean, that's again one of those subjective things that the committee shouldn't be considering. They should be considering the results rather than the margin of victory. I know talking to people, they tend to think, okay, a 2-point loss, or in this case, or even just a single-digit loss is better than getting blown out. But at the end of the day, it's not. It's going to be evaluated the same as, by the committee, regardless of the margin.
Yep. And so the Massey ratings, which we talked about, I believe does include margin of victory somewhat, because margin of victory is useful information, but it can also be really subjective. And I don't know what the goals were of the committee, but I can see them not wanting to create an incentive for, say, Transylvania to win by 45 in a game versus 35, right? Like, that's not an incentive that you want to create as an organization. Now, looking at, Baldwin Wallace and Ohio Northern went to overtime and one of them lost by 2. That loss obviously is an impressive loss, different than losing to kind of a poor team by 10, right? Like, absolutely. We know that. We watch the games. But that's a really hard thing to include in objective criteria that all of these committee members are using to rank 430 teams.
Again,
right?
there's a lot of teams, because Christopher Newport was taken into overtime and only won by 2 in a game not too long ago against Washington Lee. So there's a lot of results like that when you start to look up and down the resumes.
For sure. I'll take this one. So does a loss against a team that's under 500, is that seen the same as a loss to a 24-1 team? So the committee is not looking at these individual games. So they are rarely, I think they're never looking at, besides head-to-head, they're not looking at, team A beat team B and evaluating the value of that single game result. But it does affect the criteria. So these 2 losses compared, the loss affects your winning percentage the same, right? Depending on if it's to a really bad team or a really good team. However, it affects your strength of schedule. So let's say this below 500 team was actually 1-24 was their record. Well, then roughly speaking, their 1 win and 24 losses get added to your strength of schedule and will bring that strength of schedule lower. But if you lose to that 24-1 team, you get, roughly speaking, 24 wins and 1 loss added to your strength of schedule that will bring your strength of schedule up. And so that's kind of what strength of schedule is trying to do, is say, like, hey, over the course of the season, we'll give you credit for wins and we'll take away credit for losses. But we also want a way to gauge the collective body of strength of team that you faced. But this does highlight an issue that Riley and I have discussed, which is strength of schedule aggregates the records of all the teams that you've played. And it is way different if I play 12 teams that are 1-24 and 12 teams that are 24-1 versus kind of a body of teams of all different records that maybe comes out to the exact same strength of schedule. And so distribution of the types of teams that you play has a huge impact on how well you do, but it has no impact on your strength of schedule, if that makes sense.
Yep. I'd agree completely on that.
We love these questions. I think that wraps it up, unless we've got one on Twitter.
That's all I've gotten. And again, feel free, if you read the blog that I run, The Scoop on D3 Women's Hoops, or follow me on Twitter. Same thing with Scott. As we said, we're willing to answer these questions all week long. Any time of the day, really. Like, we will get back to you and make sure your questions are answered. So feel free to reach out to us anytime.
Thanks everyone for joining. See you later.